Javier Rodriguez trudged along the busy corridors of Crestwood Academy, his scuffed boots echoing on the polished tile floors. Barely 16, he was slight, standing at just over 5 feet and lanky as a beanpole, his hand-me-down clothes swallowing his slight frame. Deep shadows lined his eyes from the late-night shifts he worked at the local diner, helping his widowed grandmother cover the bills. His sandy brown hair was always disheveled, and he kept his gaze lowered to avoid the stares and snickers that followed him like a curse. The students at Crestwood Academy hailed from affluent families, driving sports cars that cost more than Javier's grandma earned in 5 years. Their brand-name jackets, sleek tablets, and breezy chats about weekend getaways to the coast served as harsh reminders that he was an outsider. He was the charity student, the scholarship case who'd arrived from the poorer side of town when the community center he used to go to ran out of money. Javier clutched his old satchel tighter as he headed toward his assigned spot, trying to disappear among the chattering clusters of students. In his pocket, 6 worn dollar bills represented his entire bus fare for the week, money his grandma had pieced together by selling old furniture and forgoing her medications. He'd learned to make those dollars stretch, walking home when possible and skipping meals frequently. "Well, look what we have here." The voice turned Javier's blood to ice. Dustin Sinclair appeared from behind a group of lockers like a lion spotting its prey. At 17, Dustin was everything Javier wasn't, towering, powerfully built, and radiating the kind of easy assurance that came from never having to worry about expenses. His dad managed several law firms downtown, and Dustin made sure nobody forgot it. Top brand sneakers, the newest smartphone, and a shiny new convertible in the parking area broadcasted his status to everyone who glanced his way. Behind Dustin stood his usual crew. Ricky the Hammer Hamilton, built like a refrigerator with hands like catcher's mitts, and Zach Chen, shorter but nasty, with cold eyes that seemed to revel in other people's misery. They called themselves the Apex Group, though Javier secretly thought of them as hyenas circling a weak animal. "Going to class, scholarship kid?" Dustin's voice dripped with a mocking tone that made Javier's stomach churn with fear. "Hope you remembered to bring your tribute today. The Dustin Sinclair Benevolence Fund is always accepting donations." Javier tried to walk around them, but Ricky moved to block his path. The corridor felt smaller, the walls closing in as other students hurried by, their eyes carefully averted. Everyone at Crestwood Academy knew the silent rule. You didn't mess with Dustin Sinclair's games unless you wanted to become his next victim. "I don't have any cash," Javier said quietly, which was technically true. The $6 in his pocket was for transportation, and giving it up would mean walking many miles home after work and school. Dustin's laugh was short and cruel. "Everyone has cash, scholarship kid. It's just a matter of perspective. Now, I'm going to ask you kindly one more time." He held out his hand, palm up, his expensive bracelet catching the overhead lights. "Contribution to the fund. $6 should do it." Javier felt his face flush with shame and anger, but he kept his voice even. "I require that money to get to and from school and my job." "Transportation?" Zach snickered. "What are you going to do with $6? Ride the bus like a pauper? Come on, man, splurge a little, contribute to a good cause." "The good cause being Dustin's weekend party fund," Ricky added, cracking his knuckles ominously. Javier could feel many eyes on him now, students pretending to check their lockers while secretly watching the scene unfold. Phones were already out, ready to record the inevitable. At Crestwood Academy, humiliation was a prized possession, and Dustin was about to make a big withdrawal from Javier's dignity. "Please," Javier said, hating how desperate he sounded. "I'll pay you back later. I simply require—" "You'll pay me back?" Dustin's voice rose with fake shock. "You'll pay me back with what? Your grandma's money from selling her belongings?" The bus reference hit like a physical blow. Javier's grandma did indeed sell her possessions, including some family heirlooms, to make ends meet, sacrificing comfort and memories for survival. It was honorable, selfless work, but Dustin made it sound cheap and pathetic. "Don't speak about my grandma," Javier said quietly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Dustin leaned in closer, close enough that Javier could smell his designer cologne and see the cruel delight in his eyes. "Oh, did I strike a nerve? What's she gonna do? Come here and sell more of her things in your defense?" Something snapped inside Javier's chest, a carefully maintained dam that had been holding back years of training and instinct. For just a heartbeat, his body shifted automatically into a fighting position, weight centered on his feet, hands loose and ready, chin tucked slightly. It was ingrained habit from countless hours in the dojo, from a life that felt like a dream from long ago. But then, reality crashed back in. This wasn't the training floor at Nakamura's dojo, where his grandfather had taught him since he was 6 years old. This wasn't the place where Kenji Nakamura, former national karate champion, had taught his grandson every technique, every kata, every hard-won lesson about respect and self-control. That world had vanished 4 years ago when his grandparents fell sick and couldn't keep up with payments. After their health rapidly declined, everything had crumbled. The dojo closed when they couldn't afford the property taxes. His grandma sold almost everything to pay the medical bills. And Javier made a pledge to himself and to his grandparents' memory. He would never use his martial arts outside of self-defense. Violence had claimed his family's dreams, and he wouldn't let it consume him too. Javier forced himself to relax, to step back down from the edge of violence. "Just leave me alone," he muttered, reaching into his pocket for the crumpled bills. "That's more like it," Dustin said with satisfaction, watching as Javier's fingers closed around the money. "See how easy that was? Why do we have to go through this charade every single time?" Every time. That was the issue. This wasn't the first time Dustin had demanded his money, and it wouldn't be the last. It had started small. $1 now, 50 cents then, always with the facade that it was some kind of joke or harmless fun. But as Javier's passive resistance made it clear he wouldn't retaliate, the demands had grown. "I don't have $6, Javier said, pulling out 4 worn singles. "This is all I possess." Dustin's expression darkened. "That's not going to cut it, scholarship kid. $6 was the agreed price. If you can't afford the full payment, perhaps we need to discuss alternative forms of compensation." Javier looked at the $4 in his hand, knowing it represented less than half his transportation budget for the week. Giving it up meant walking, but refusing might mean something far worse. $6, Dustin repeated, his voice taking on a sharp edge that made nearby students step further away. "Or maybe we need to have a more direct conversation about your place in this academy." The threat hung in the air like a thick fog. Javier could feel the weight of every stare, every phone camera pointed in his direction, every whispered comment that would follow him through the corridors for weeks to come. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "In the dojo, you fight with honor. Outside the dojo, you walk away with dignity." But where was the dignity in this? Where was the honor in being systematically humiliated while everyone watched and did nothing? Javier handed over the $4, his face burning with shame. "That's all I possess," he repeated. Dustin pocketed the cash with theatrical satisfaction. "Well then, I guess we'll have to call this an initial payment. You can bring me the other $2 tomorrow, plus interest. Let's say $4 total for the inconvenience." "That's not just," Javier said quietly. "Just?" Dustin's laugh was sharp and cruel. "You want to talk about just? Is it just that you get to attend this academy on a scholarship while students who actually belong here have to fight for spots? Is it just that you take up space that could go to someone whose family actually contributes to this community?" Ricky and Zach nodded along like faithful followers. though Javier suspected they were just as uncomfortable with Dustin's cruelty as everyone else. They'd learned, like most people, that it was easier to agree with Dustin Sinclair than to challenge him. "I earned my spot here," Javier said, his voice barely audible. "Earned it?" Dustin's voice dripped with mock surprise. "With what? Your sob story about your sick grandparents and your poverty-stricken family. Please, you're here because some bleeding-heart administrator decided this academy needed more diversity, and you were the best charity case they could find." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum pain. Javier felt tears threatening behind his eyes, but he refused to give Dustin the satisfaction of seeing him cry. Instead, he turned and started walking away, leaving behind the laughter and whispers that followed him like a dark cloud. He made it to the restroom before the emotions overwhelmed him. Locking himself in a stall, Javier let the frustration and humiliation wash over him. In his mind, he could see his grandfather's face, could hear Kenji Nakamura's voice explaining the principles of karate. "Every martial artist has a choice," his grandfather had said during one of their last training sessions. "You can fight with anger, or you can fight with purpose. Anger makes you sloppy, makes you vulnerable. Purpose makes you precise, makes you invincible." But what was the purpose in this situation? What was the point of having skills if you couldn't use them when you needed them most? Javier knew he could drop Dustin Sinclair with a single clean strike. Years of training had given him speed and power that would shock anyone who judged him by his size. He'd sparred with grown men, competed in regional tournaments, held his own against opponents who outweighed him by 60 pounds. But none of that mattered outside the dojo. Outside the dojo, violence only led to more violence, and Javier couldn't afford to get suspended or expelled. His scholarship depended on maintaining good grades and staying out of trouble. One fight, one moment of lost control, and he'd lose everything his family had sacrificed for. The harassment continued to escalate over the following weeks. Dustin seemed to take Javier's passivity as permission to push harder, to demand more, to inflict greater humiliations. The daily tribute demand became just one part of a systematic campaign of cruelty designed to break Javier's spirit. Accidental shoves in the corridor became regular occurrences, always timed when teachers weren't looking. Javier's assigned spot was vandalized with marker-scrawled words like pauper and freeloader, the cleaning staff removing it eventually, but never fast enough to prevent many students from seeing it. His satchel was accidentally knocked from his hands, scattering his books and papers across the floor while Dustin and his friends watched with amusement. But it was the psychological warfare that hurt the most. Dustin had a talent for finding Javier's most vulnerable spots and pressing on them with surgical precision. Comments about his grandparents' sickness, his grandma's sacrifices, his hand-me-down clothes, and his scholarship status became a daily soundtrack of humiliation. "Hey, scholarship kid," Dustin would call out in the cafeteria, loud enough for most of the room to hear. "How's your grandma enjoying her new financial status? I heard she's having difficulty making payments. Is that where you get your money now?" The lies were almost worse than the truth. Javier's grandma had never struggled, had never failed to meet a payment, but the rumors spread through the academy like wildfire. Students who had previously ignored him now looked at him with suspicion or pity. Teachers who had seemed supportive became more distant, as if they were questioning whether he really belonged at Crestwood Academy. 4 weeks into the school year, Javier had lost 15 pounds from skipping meals to pay Dustin's daily tax. His grades were starting to slip as he spent more time working extra shifts at the diner to make up for the lost money. Dark shadows under his eyes had deepened, and his clothes hung even more loosely on his shrinking frame. His grandma noticed, of course. Maria Rodriguez wasn't the kind of woman who missed details, especially when it came to her only grandson. "Mijo, you're not eating enough," she said one evening as they sat at their small kitchen table, sharing a dinner of soup and bread that she'd stretched to last 2 meals. "Are you experiencing difficulties at the academy?" Javier looked at his grandma's worried face, seeing the exhaustion lines that came from working long hours to keep them afloat. She was already carrying so much weight, so much responsibility. How could he add his problems to her burden? "I'm fine, abuela," he lied, "just overwhelmed with studies." Maria studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people's true intentions through years of hardship. "Javier, you know you can confide in me about anything, right? If someone is troubling you." "I said I'm fine," Javier repeated, his voice sharper than he'd intended. The hurt that flashed across his grandma's face made him instantly regret his tone, but the damage was done. That night, lying in bed and listening to his grandma's exhausted breathing through the thin walls of their apartment, Javier stared at the framed photograph on his nightstand. It showed him and his grandfather at the dojo, both of them smiling and holding up karate belts after Javier had won his first regional tournament. He'd been 12 then, already showing real promise in martial arts. "You possess natural talent, mijo," his grandfather had said that day. "But talent without discipline is simply wasted potential. The dojo will teach you about yourself, about what you're truly made of when everything else is stripped away." Javier knew what he was made of. He'd proven it many times in sanctioned competitions, against opponents who came at him with everything they had. But those fights had rules, referees, safety equipment. They had honor and respect, even in defeat. What Dustin was doing wasn't fighting. It was systematic cruelty, designed to break him down piece by piece until there was nothing left but compliance and fear. And the worst part was that Javier's refusal to defend himself was only making it worse. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in November. Javier arrived at the academy to find his assigned spot vandalized again, but this time the damage was worse. Someone had broken the lock and dumped the contents all over the corridor floor. His textbooks were scattered and torn, his notebooks soaked with what smelled like soda, and his only photo of his grandparents, the one he kept taped inside his assigned spot, was crumpled and stepped on. Students walked past the mess, some laughing, others looking uncomfortable but unwilling to help. Javier knelt in the corridor, trying to salvage what he could, his hands shaking as he carefully smoothed out the damaged photograph. "Oops," came Dustin's voice from behind him. "Looks like someone had an accident with their spot. That's unfortunate." Javier didn't turn around. He couldn't trust himself to look at Dustin's smirking face without doing something he'd regret. Instead, he continued gathering his ruined belongings, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You know," Dustin continued, his voice taking on that familiar mocking tone, "maybe this wouldn't occur if you paid your dues on time. The benevolence fund exists for a reason. Leave him be." The voice came from somewhere behind Dustin, soft but clear. Javier looked up to see Maya Chen standing near her locker with a stack of folders in her arms. She was one of the quiet students too, but unlike Javier, she seemed to fade into the background by choice rather than circumstance. She was pretty in an understated way, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that usually stayed focused on her studies. Dustin's attention shifted to her like a predator scenting new prey. "Well, well, looks like Scholarship Kid has a defender. How quaint." Maya's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "I said leave him be. He hasn't done anything to you." "Hasn't done anything?" Dustin's voice rose with theatrical outrage. "He's occupying space that belongs to real students. He's here on charity, stealing opportunities from students who actually deserve them." Ricky and Zach had moved to flank Maya now, forming their usual triangle of intimidation. Javier felt his chest tighten with a familiar rage, the same feeling he'd gotten in the dojo when an opponent threw a cheap shot or fought dirty. "Just disregard them," Maya whispered to Javier. "They're not worth it." but they were worth it. Not because of what they were doing to him. Javier had learned to absorb that kind of punishment. They were worth it because now they were threatening Maya, someone whose only offense was showing him a moment of basic human decency. "You know what I think?" Dustin said, his voice carrying that edge that meant real trouble was coming. "I think our little charity case here has been hiding out on us. I think he possesses more money than he admits." He gestured to Ricky, who grabbed Javier's satchel and dumped its contents across the floor. Javier's work apron tumbled out, along with his worn textbooks, a half-eaten sandwich he'd been saving for lunch, and his wallet. Dustin snatched up the wallet and opened it, finding the $15 bill Javier had been saving for his grandma's medicine next month. "Well, well," Dustin said with mock surprise. "What do we have here? Looks like Scholarship Kid has been deceiving us." "That's not mine to give," Javier said quietly, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "It's for my grandma's medication." Dustin held the 15 up to the light as if checking for counterfeits. "Your grandma's medication? How touching. But see, you owe me quite a bit of back payments plus interest. I think this just about covers it." "Give it back," Javier said, standing slowly. Something in his voice made Dustin pause. For just a moment, uncertainty flickered across the bully's face. Javier was standing differently now, his weight centered on his feet, his hands loose at his sides. Everything about his posture screamed danger to anyone who knew how to read the signs. But Dustin Sinclair wasn't one of those people. "Or what?" he said, pocketing the 15. "You gonna do something about it, Scholarship Kid? You gonna finally develop a backbone?" Javier looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just Dustin, but every bully who'd ever used their size or status to hurt someone weaker. He thought about his grandparents, about the pledge he'd made, about the violence that had claimed his family's dreams 4 years ago. Then he thought about Maya, about her courage in speaking up when no one else would. He thought about his grandma, working long hours and still finding ways to smile. He thought about that $15 bill, earned through hours of scrubbing floors and waiting tables, meant to buy the medication the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him required. Sometimes, Javier realized, keeping one pledge meant breaking another. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge that made several nearby students stop and stare. "I believe I am." Dustin threw the first punch, a clumsy right hand that telegraphed itself from many feet away. In the old days, before the pledge, before the guilt, Javier would have slipped it easily and countered with devastating precision. This time was no different. Javier moved like water, slipping Dustin's punch by inches and coming back with a textbook-perfect roundhouse kick that caught the bigger student right on the chin. Dustin's eyes glazed over and he dropped like a stone, his expensive sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The corridor erupted in shocked silence. Ricky rushed forward, his massive frame moving with surprising speed, but Javier was already in motion. 4 years of inactivity fell away like an old coat as ingrained habit took over. He ducked under Ricky's wild swing and delivered a precise palm strike into the bigger student's sternum, folding him in half. Zach tried to grab Javier from behind, but Javier had heard his footsteps. A martial artist learns to use all his senses. He spun, breaking Zach's grip with a technique his grandfather had drilled into him thousands of times, and followed up with a clean elbow strike that sent Zach stumbling backward into a row of lockers. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 40 seconds. 3 bigger, stronger opponents lay on the ground, groaning and struggling to catch their breath, while Javier stood over them, barely breathing hard. The crowd of students that had gathered was silent, their phones out and recording, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "Here's how this will function," Javier said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He looked down at Dustin, who was struggling to sit up with blood trickling from his nose. "You're going to give me back my money, all of it, every dollar you've taken from me over the past few weeks." Dustin wiped blood from his nose with a shaking hand. This isn't finished. Javier crouched down so he was eye level with the fallen bully. Yes, it is. Because if you ever touch me again, if you ever demand money from anyone else, if you ever make someone feel small simply because you can, I'll be present. And next time, I won't restrain myself. He stood and offered his hand to Maya, helping her gather her scattered folders while ignoring the phones that were still recording and the growing crowd of students who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. The quiet scholarship student, the easy target, the charity case had just dismantled 3 bigger opponents with surgical precision. Dustin struggled to his feet, his designer clothes wrinkled and his ego bruised worse than his face. You think this makes you tough? You think this alters anything? Javier turned back to face him, and for the first time in months, his voice carried real authority. I believe it alters everything. The question is whether you're intelligent enough to realize that. Dean Thompson arrived within minutes, summoned by the commotion and the flood of social media posts that were already spreading through the academy. Javier expected suspension, expulsion, perhaps even legal charges. Instead, he found himself sitting in the dean's office, listening to a series of student testimonies about Dustin's systematic bullying campaign. It seems, Dean Thompson said carefully, studying the statements piled on his desk, that this incident was the consequence of ongoing harassment that our staff failed to address appropriately. He looked at Javier with something that might have been respect. While I cannot officially endorse fighting, I understand that sometimes students are pushed beyond reasonable limits. Dustin, sporting a bandaged nose and a severely bruised ego, sat in the corner with his parents. His father, a prominent lawyer who donated significantly to the academy's programs, was red-faced with humiliation. His mother kept shooting worried glances at Javier as if she couldn't quite believe her son had been bested by someone half his size. There will be repercussions for everyone involved, the dean continued. But given the circumstances and the testimonies we've received, I believe in-school suspension would be appropriate rather than expulsion. Javier nodded, accepting the punishment. It was fair, even lenient considering what could have occurred, but more importantly, it sent a message to every other bully in the academy. Actions have consequences, and sometimes the quiet students aren't as helpless as they seem. The video of the fight went viral within hours, spreading far beyond the walls of Crestwood Academy. Students who had never spoken to Javier before approached him in the corridors, some to congratulate him, others to share their own stories of being victimized. Teachers who had previously overlooked him began including him in class discussions, treating him with newfound respect. But the biggest transformation was in Javier himself. He walked taller now, spoke with more assurance, and no longer felt the urge to make himself invisible. He wasn't looking for fights, but he wasn't running from confrontation either. Word had spread about his martial arts background, and suddenly everyone wanted to know his story. Maya, who had found her own courage in Javier's example, became his closest friend at the academy. She told him later that watching him stand up to Dustin had inspired her to speak up in class, to join the student government, to stop concealing her intelligence behind a veil of invisibility. You demonstrated to me that being different isn't something to be ashamed of, she said one day as they sat together at lunch, at a table that was no longer empty. It's something to be proud of. Dustin, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale. The video of his defeat had humiliated him in front of the entire academy, and his reputation as an unstoppable force had been shattered in less than 40 seconds. His core group of friends remained loyal, but the fear and automatic respect he'd commanded were gone forever. Javier saw him sometimes in the corridors, walking with his head down, probably feeling some small fraction of the humiliation he'd inflicted on others. Part of Javier felt sympathy for him, understanding now that bullies were often victims themselves, acting out their own pain and insecurity on easier targets. But mostly, Javier felt satisfied that justice had been served. He'd kept his pledge to his grandparents in spirit, if not in letter, using violence only as a last resort and only to protect himself and someone who couldn't protect themselves. And he'd used it with restraint and precision, never crossing the line from self-defense to aggression. The incident had altered more than just the dynamics between Javier and Dustin. It had sent ripples throughout the entire academy, empowering other victims to speak up and making potential bullies think twice before targeting someone who seemed vulnerable. Teachers paid closer attention to social dynamics in their classrooms. Students were more likely to intervene when they saw harassment occurring. Most importantly, Javier had learned that strength wasn't just about the ability to deliver a blow or withstand one. Real strength was about standing up for what was just, even when it was frightening. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was about refusing to let fear dictate your actions or define your character. As Javier walked through the corridors of Crestwood Academy now, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. He wore his hand-me-down clothes with pride, ate his simple lunches without shame, and faced each day knowing that he belonged there just as much as anyone else. The scholarship student who had once been seen as an easy target had become something much more valuable, a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest voices make the loudest statements when they finally decide to speak.